Okay. Es tut mir leid, dass ich Deutsch kann nicht Deutsch sprechen, or at least not very much. And so you will have to put up with my English. I will speak slowly, and it's well amplified. And I hope you're able to follow what I say. This presentation is called Dharma and Sangha in a Secular Age. And I'm going to present it in two parts. The first part is called the past, the Vergangenheit. And the second part is called the present, the Gegenwart. Is that right? Yes. And you might wonder why I want to talk about Buddhist history when we're going to be looking not only this evening, and you've been looking at it through the day, but also over the weekend, we're going to be looking at Buddhism in society. I want to go back just to help us rethink where we are coming from, at least in my understanding. And by we, I mean the Buddhist community that's emerging in modernity, and particularly here in Europe. Buddhism is often presented as a religion. For many people, that is self-evident. The taxi driver who brought me from Heidelberg Hauptbahnhof here a few hours ago was quite convinced it was a religion. I tried to explain otherwise, but my German wasn't up to it. But when we think of Buddhism as a religion, and there's very many good grounds for doing that, then automatically we tend to compare Gautama with Jesus. We have Gautama the Buddha and Jesus the Christ. And that, for many people, will be the obvious comparison between the Buddhist tradition and our own Christian tradition here. But if we think of, not so much of Buddhism, but if we think of the Dharma, not so much as a religion, but more as a culture, a way of life, a philosophy, which, for those of you who know my work, is my own preference, then the comparison with Jesus doesn't make so much sense. And instead, I find it more useful to think of Gautama as being more like Socrates. There are some remarkable parallels between Gautama and Socrates. The first, perhaps, is the fact that they both lived at the same time. And they both lived on opposite ends of the Persian Empire that was the main center of power in Eurasia at that period. The Persian Empire extended all the way to Thrace, which is this side of Istanbul, into Greece, and all the way into what is now Pakistan. Socrates was slightly to the west of it, the Buddha was a little bit further to the east of it. But contemporary scholarly dating of the Buddha puts him now at 480 to 400 about, which turns out to be the same dating as Socrates. Another thing that is striking in terms of these two men is that, at least in the Buddha's earliest teaching, he comes across very much as a skeptic. In other words, somebody who is not invested in views and opinions and doctrines and dogmas. Particularly in the early Pali texts of the Sutta Nipata, that some of you might be familiar with, it's quite clear that Gautama is very suspicious about metaphysical truth claims. He advocates a wariness about claiming anything to be true. There's one verse in the Sutta Nipata that says, this is true, that is what fools say to one another. Socrates, likewise, is famous for saying that the only thing he knows is that he knows nothing. He too was very reluctant to take a position. Now, another parallel is also that both of them focused primarily on ethics. Not ethics in terms of prescriptive morality, precepts and so forth, but ethics as a way of understanding how we could live to the full as human beings. A quest to lead a life in which we become the sort of person we aspire to be. In Greek they call this eudaimonia, sometimes translated as happiness, but nowadays, in English at least, as human flourishing. Socrates is noted in the Greek sources for having somehow made ethics rather than physics, or the thinking about the natural world, as the primary focus of his work as a philosopher. And I think we should also make a case, or at least I would make a case, that that is something utterly characteristic of the Dharma as well. It's about how do we live well, not what is the nature of reality, what is the nature of the world. Another parallel is that neither Socrates nor Gautama left any written record of their teachings. They taught instead through dialogue, through engagement with particular people in particular situations. And another parallel, which is connected to that one, is that they left a community of disciples who were somehow able to then articulate and develop their own understanding, their own insight, their own approach. In the Buddha's case, to the Dharma. In Socrates' case, when you look at the range of his disciples, from Plato and Aristotle all the way to people like Aristippus, you get a great range of approaches and styles to what philosophy is about. Gautama famously encouraged his students to become independent of others in the Dharma. So we could say that Socrates and Gautama both created a space in which others could flourish. Both of them we might consider to be masters of negative capability, to use the term of John Keats. They opened up a space of possibility. They held that space within a certain vision, but they empowered individual men and women to learn how to think and act for themselves in order to fully realize their potential as human beings. Now, I want to go back to a couple of early Pali texts in which we get a glimpse of the kind of community, the kind of sangha that Gautama envisioned. It's completely true that when we read the early Pali texts, we have the sense that the sangha is the monks and the nuns, the monastic community. And in fact, I don't think the word Sangha is ever used to refer to a lay Sangha or a Sangha of Upasaka and Upasika. It's always Bhikkhu Sangha. And yet, the word Sangha is used in the Pali to simply denote the oligarchic communities of the early republics in India that governed themselves through a group leadership rather than there being a king who had autocratic power. So the word Sangha was already in use at the Buddha's time, and it referred to a certain form of social arrangement or government that was more collective than autocratic. But when Gautama described what it was he sought to establish on earth, he used the word parisa. Parisa would perhaps better be translated as something like assembly. It's similar to Sangha, it's just a little bit broader. And there's a passage that I find very telling about how he envisages his parisa, his assembly, his following, let's say. We don't have time to go into the context of where this passage appears, but in an early Sanskrit fragment, this passage occurs shortly after the awakening. He's still in Bodh Gaya. He's given some food by some passing merchants, and he gets terribly sick because he hasn't been eating much recently, and he kind of overdoes it. And he's curling up on the ground in great pain, and then Mara, the devil, appears to him and says, "You've attained nirvana, now the wise thing to do would be to leave this world and die." And this is what Gautama says. That passage, by the way, is not found in the Pali account of the awakening, but it is found in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. Towards the end of the Buddha's life, he recalls this episode and says exactly the same as he said to Mara in that Sanskrit text. He says, "I will not pass away until I have monks and nuns, laymen and laywomen, who are accomplished, trained, skilled, learned, knowers of the Dharma, trained in conformity with the Dharma, walking in the path of the Dharma, who will pass on what they have gained from their teacher, teach it, declare it, establish it, analyze it, make it clear. They shall be able, by means of the Dharma, to refute false teachings that have arisen and teach the Dharma of wondrous effect," in Maurice Walsh's translation. Now, what's interesting about this passage is that he quite clearly is not setting up a community in which you have the monks and the nuns who are the trained professionals who then teach the layperson, the laymen and the laywomen, who support them with dana in order that the Dharma can flourish at the hands of these full-time committed practitioners. That's the model we have pretty much in Asia today. Whereas here, he makes no difference at all between what he expects of his monks, his nuns, his laymen, and his laywomen. All of them are to be trained, skilled, learned, walking in the path, passing on what they've gained, teaching it, declaring it. He doesn't privilege one aspect of the community, the monks and the nuns, as having this task. Everybody is expected to aspire to this kind of engagement with his teaching. Here's another passage. This is from the Anguttara Nikaya. And he's talking here about 21 lay followers. They're all men, unfortunately. And he describes them all with exactly the same set of words. And the first one on the list is Mahanama. Mahanama was the Buddha's cousin who took on the job of running Sakya after the Buddha had gone off to become the Buddha. And he says, possessing 6 qualities, the householder Mahanama has found fulfillment in the true person, the Tathagata, become a seer of the deathless, and he goes about his life from the perspective of the deathless. And what are these 6 qualities? Conviction in Buddha, conviction in Dharma, conviction in Sangha, noble virtue, noble understanding, and noble liberation. The same description is then given of another 20 lay people of his time, some of whom we've heard of, like Anathapindika and others, some of whom are lost to history. But all of them are people completely engaged in the world. They are business people, they are government officials, they are merchants, they are doctors. None of them have the slightest interest, or they don't show any interest in becoming monks, but nonetheless, they are seers of the deathless, and they live their lives from the perspective of the deathless. They have conviction in the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and they have noble understanding and noble liberation. This language is very rarely, if ever, applied to lay people. And yet here we have a text that points to I think the very real possibility that at the Buddha's time there was a community which was equally comprised of men and women, of lay people, and of professional monks and nuns. That's the parisa. And this passage, I think, with Mahanama somehow supports very much that the lay people too were living their lives from the perspective of the deathless. The deathless, of course, being nirvana, from the perspective of nirvana. They've seen nirvana and they go about in the world from that seeing of nirvana. And they have achieved this liberation and this understanding that is beyond that of the ordinary, everyday life. Now this suggests that at the Buddha's time, there may well have been secular communities as well as monastic communities. And I'm using the word secular here to talk really as a loose term to refer to the lay people. We have a huge amount of information about the monastic communities. We know all about their rules and all of the things they got up to that meant that the Buddha had to create new rules and so forth and so on. We have a very, very vivid picture of this early Buddhist monastic community. We have virtually no idea at all of how the lay people lived or what kind of associations and communities they formed among themselves. The lay people are presented almost exclusively as the servants and the supporters of the monastics. Now, of course, the reason for this could simply be that the texts that have come down to us were memorized and preserved by the monastics. In other words, quite innocently, I'm not suggesting some conspiracy, but quite understandably, this community, this sangha of monks and nuns, particularly monks, chose to remember those texts that spoke to their needs and their interests and their condition. If the suttas had been memorized by, let's say, some lay guilds of goldsmiths or doctors or something, those texts would have reflected, obviously, the concerns of the people who were remembering and preserving these ideas. So, scholars who have tried to get a clearer picture of what the lay communities were like have very little to go on. Often they have to look at things like donor inscriptions that are carved on the entrances to some of these rock-cut temples in India. And I'll just give you one little example, which is somewhat picked at random. Some of you may have heard of the monastery of Karla or Karli sometimes. It's 2 or 3 hours east of Bombay in the Western Ghats. It's the largest rock-cut temple in India. It's almost the size of a small cathedral. It's cut into a mountain. It's in almost perfect condition. And it is 2,000 years old. It was built at the time of Jesus. And there on the outside of that, you have some inscriptions that talk about the people who built this place or funded this place. And amongst these, we read about the perfumer Simhadatta, the man who made perfume, the carpenter Sami, the Greek Sihadaya, the Greek Dhamma, and a certain Mitadevanaka. So we get a very, very, very tiny glimpse of these people. That's all we know about them, their names. Except for 2 of them, they were Greeks, which is, again, for us perhaps of interest because in northwest India, around this time, the Greek colonists who lived in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, once they lost power in Athens and Rome ascended, they converted to Buddhism, by and large. So these are presumably some of these Greek converts. So it's very possible that whatever secular communities there might have been around this early period, they either died out or they were overrun by Brahminical societies, communities, or they became followers of Jains and other Indian religious groups. And we consequently have lost any sense of that. And it's also true as Buddhism further developed in India. Of course, it survived right up until about the 12th century AD. Once again, we don't know much, if anything, about what these lay communities were like, what the Buddhist secular world would have involved. Now, my sense, and this is very much a hypothesis rather than something that I would claim to be true, is that this distinction between the monastic community and the secular community, or the religious and the secular communities, seems to mirror also the kind of distinction that I've been making between thinking of the Buddha's teaching in terms of Four Noble Truths and thinking of the Buddha's teaching in terms of 4 great tasks. I'm kind of assuming that if you're here, you're probably familiar with this distinction. But basically, we find in the Buddha's first discourse, or what is supposed to be his first discourse, I don't think it actually was, we find this intriguing conclusion where he says that he could not consider himself to be fully awake until he had recognized, performed, and mastered these 4 tasks. He doesn't call them 4 tasks in so many words, but it's basically until he had fully understood dukkha, life, had let go of craving and reactivity, had seen for himself the stopping of reactivity, which is the deathless nirvana, and he had cultivated and developed a way of life according to the Eightfold Path. Now, that model to me, the task model, seems to be better suited to a secular community than a religious community. The Four Noble Truths, life is suffering, which causes craving, the end of craving is the end of suffering and the attainment of nirvana, and the way to the end of suffering is the practice of the Eightfold Path, is much more suited, I would argue, to a monastic community. Particularly a monastic community that we can see from the Pali Suttas themselves came quite quickly during the Buddha's life, and particularly after the Buddha's death, as run by former Brahmins, Sariputta, Moggallana, and particularly Mahakassa. And we do witness in the suttas a power struggle between Ananda, Buddha's attendant and cousin, or maybe his nephew, and the Brahminical monks. And I wonder, in fact, whether what these two models of truths and tasks might reflect are the respective priorities and aims of a lay as opposed to a monastic community. We can see a similar development, if I take just one example from within that model, and that is the way in which the word bhavana has been understood. Bhavana, nowadays, is almost invariably understood as meditation. When they translated it into Tibetan in the 8th century, it was translated as gom. And gom is the standard Tibetan word for meditation. In other words, sitting cross-legged, doing certain spiritual exercises. Whereas the word bhavana originally has a much broader sense simply of cultivation or development. And for the Buddha, the whole of the Eightfold Path is to be cultivated and to be developed. It's not to be meditated. But even in Theravada countries today, in ordinary speech at least, people will say that they've got to go and do my bhavana, my practice, which means my meditation of some kind. And so we move from the task model, which is one of magga bhavana, cultivating and developing the path, the Eightfold Path, becomes in the later traditions bhavana marga, almost invariably translated as the path of meditation. I think here you get to see, through the simple inversion of these two words, magga and bhavana, you get to see a different emphasis, a different priority. And I would suggest that the secular community was concerned about cultivating and developing a way of life, whereas the monastic community was primarily concerned about developing meditative skills and practices in order to break free from the cycle of birth and death and to attain the final nirvana. And also, I think we can also detect by looking more carefully at the terms used in the Eightfold Path itself that many of these terms seem to have been given a monastic gloss or reading. I'm not going to go into this now, but over the weekend I want to come back to this. Particularly the terms sankappa, kamanta, and ajiva. Sankappa is usually translated as right intention or thought, whereas actually it probably comes closer to what we would understand by imagination, creating things, developing things, building things. Kamanta is translated as right action, whereas the word kamanta everywhere else except in this context simply means work, employment, occupation. And ajiva, which is usually translated as livelihood, and that gets blurred with work and employment. I think ajiva basically has to do with how we survive. how we survive. But I'm going to go back to that over the weekend. It's also possible that this distinction between the secular approach and the religious approach at the Buddha's time may have been a reflection of the two principal cultures that were meeting during the Buddha's life in that part of India. And these are the cultures of what's called the Greater Magadha, which is in the east, including all of the areas where the Buddha was born, where he taught, where Magadha and Kosala existed. This has been called broadly Greater Magadha by the Swiss scholar Johannes Bronkhorst. I don't know if you're familiar with Bronkhorst's work. He's written two books. One is called Greater Magadha, and the other one is called Buddhism in the Shadow of Brahmanism. I've been very influenced by Bronkhorst's work. Bronkhorst's argument is that in the part of the area where the Buddha was born and did most of his teaching work, the country, the places had not yet been Brahmanized. Brahmanism did not yet exert its impact, particularly its social impact, in that far eastern part of the Gangetic Basin. Whereas Brahmanism at the Buddha's time was primarily concentrated in the west, usually as far as what's called the Doab, kind of where the Yamuna River meets the Ganges, quite a way west of Benares. And Brahminical texts, Panini's grammar, for example, quite clearly considers the eastern part of India as a non-Aryan place. It's not where the Aryans, which implies for them, I guess, the Brahmins and the caste system, would have extended at that time. So the idea that the Buddha grew up in the caste system, the idea that he was taught by Brahmin priests, and he rejected the idea of Atman, this is all thrown into question. Instead, we have a picture of two quite independent communities of people, and the Buddha's teaching was primarily focused on those in this area called Greater Magadha. So that's the past, and I've spoken longer than I intended to. I'm sorry about that. Now I want to look at the present. And I'm going to start by just asking a couple of questions. Why do church services move me? They may not move you, but I find when I go into a Christian church, as I did this morning into the cathedral at Cologne, I'm moved. I can feel something in my body, in my emotions. I find myself entering what, because of my upbringing and background as a Westerner, is a sacred space. A space that is somehow out of this world, although, of course, in this world. A space in which you feel uplifted. And a space where people of all different backgrounds, complete strangers to one another, will meet together on Sundays and other holy festivals and so forth, and they'll come together to celebrate what really matters mostly in their lives, their ultimate values, conveyed through the symbols of Christianity and its rituals. And I find this moving. I find this very, 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 very seductive, attractive, and yet I can't participate in it largely because I just can't accept a lot of the language, a lot of the beliefs, a lot of the assumptions that are built into that community. Another thing I've been doing recently, in fact I was there just a few weeks ago, is walking on the Camino Frances, the French Camino that goes from, or pathway that goes from the French border to Santiago de Compostela, the famous Camino. I find likewise walking on this ancient pilgrimage trail touches me deeply. More than anything else, what I enjoy about the Camino is that it's effectively a community in movement, but a community that's not defined by any common beliefs, but is held together by whatever reasons people today walk on this thing. And there's hundreds, if not thousands of people from all over the world, of all ages, all ethnicities, all skin colours, everything. And you find yourself walking together to Compostela or wherever you're going, in the company of these other people. And I love that. I find that really, really touches me and somehow fulfills me as a person. It gives me a sense of community, a sense of belonging to in this case, very temporary group, but one that is somehow tapping into a greater depth of what it means to be human. So both of those are examples of something completely, not in a Buddhist context whatsoever, but therein lies a living sense of community, of Sangha. And I know that I somehow miss that I don't have that in my daily life. I go on retreats, I visit Buddhist monasteries sometime, but to be quite frank, I don't feel the same degree of embodied participation in a living community. So what are the spaces today in which strangers come together to acknowledge and to celebrate the deepest values that they share? And I think for many people in our secular world, this would be the concert hall, the theatre, possibly the sports arena, but probably not a religious building, probably not a church. As we know, so many of our churches, particularly in the countryside, stand empty. The church in my village in France, l'Église de Saint-Pierre, is locked for at least, for all the time. We have one mass once every 6 weeks, if we're lucky. The priest comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I sometimes go to these masses, not that I'm a Catholic, but I love being in these churches when they're being used for the purposes they were designed. It brings the community together, or very, very briefly. And I think we lose something by abandoning these beautiful communal spaces in which people have met together for hundreds of years. It's very sad. So people who are engaged in practicing Buddhism in, say, Germany today, most of them are not monks or nuns. There's hardly any monks or nuns in Germany, Buddhist monks or nuns, indigenous. No, I mean Germans, not necessarily Thais or Burmese or whatever. Buddhist monasticism, despite the efforts of many very fine people, has not really taken off. In the United States, even less so than here. Monasticism doesn't really seem to call any longer to people raised within the cultures of modernity. And in many ways, I think people find themselves as Buddhist practitioners or Dharma practitioners. They meet together on retreats, which again, very temporary things. They might meet together once a week at a local center, or a weekend like we're doing here in this space. But I think a lot of people who consider themselves engaged in this tradition meet a lot in virtual communities. They meet online. Tricycle magazine, which I've been involved with since its founding in the early 90s. It's a magazine based in New York. They've moved very successfully from the print-based magazine into this web-based community. There's currently a program on secular Dharma that Martine, my wife, and I pre-recorded this summer. It's now being broadcast on a weekly basis to 850 people worldwide. It's a very well-constructed course. We just did the basic lectures. Somebody else developed all the learning materials. People are meeting in endless discussion forums, little subgroups. There's really something going on here, but it's happening outside of any physical space. It's happening virtually, worldwide. And although I think that is a wonderful possibility that media today allow, and the technologies allow, I cannot imagine it will ever substitute for warm bodies sitting together in a room, like here. But nonetheless, for many people, that's one of their primary communal resources today. I think also a lot of people in the modern world are not really so strongly interested in having a community. There might be a certain nostalgia at having lost a sense of community, but actually they're quite happy just doing their own practice, maybe dropping in and out of different Buddhist and other spiritual venues, have a few friendships perhaps that are very close, that they can really share their interests and their ideas. They might meditate with friends together, go on occasional retreats, or they gather together in camps. There's a very famous one in England called Buddha Field, which is literally a field, a bit like the Glastonbury Festival, except it's full of tents filled with Buddhists doing all kinds of different things. And they meet, once a year for 2 or 3 weeks, and it's enormously successful. Hundreds of people go to these things. Or they go to Plum Village, which is just up the road from where I live. Every summer they get something like 1,200 people. Families, anyone can go. It's a wonderful thing, but it disperses. It doesn't consolidate at that level at all. So I'm sure I'm not saying anything that most of you are unaware of, but I'm just trying to sort of give a sketch of the landscape that we're exploring here. I also think for a number of people who are drawn to the practice of the Dharma, let's say they're drawn to the practice of mindfulness, are not particularly comfortable with the word Buddhism. Buddhism is slightly toxic for some people. It's got too much of an association with organized religion. For some people, it also presupposes that you have to believe certain things like reincarnation and different realms of existence and all kinds of magical stuff like that. And they also find that the institutions of Buddhism come across as being rather pious and devout, deferential, hierarchical, and often they feel disempowered. They feel that when they go into a religious space, a temple of some kind, the ratio of power is very much weighted on the authority of the monastic figure, usually the Lama or the Zen master. And very often you are simply part of a passive congregation who listens to what the enlightened ones are saying. And there's a very clear bifurcation or split between those who have knowledge and power and those who don't. And I know a lot of people who've started practicing mindfulness meditation, often for purely therapeutic or reasons, or maybe to develop certain calmness of mind so they can work better. And having had that initial experience, they've realized that actually this mindfulness is not just about solving a particular problem in my life, anxiety or something, but actually it affords me another stance or way of being in the world that actually touches everything in my life, not just my anxiety. It offers a new perspective. A perspective, you live your life from the perspective of the deathless, or nirvana. And that can be enormously liberating for people. And it opens up a way of living that they hadn't fully sort of really grasped before. And a quick Google search reveals that mindfulness is a Buddhist meditation practice, so they go off to their local Buddhist center and they find themselves in a space where they don't feel comfortable at all. This is not what they're looking for. But what's interesting is that they're looking for something. They're looking for some kind of communal space where they can take these experiences of insight, of freedom, of calm, further. And usually by further they mean a more comprehensive ethical and philosophical framework within which to locate their contemplative or meditative practice. So rather than talking of secular Buddhism, recently I've found it much more helpful to talk of secular Dharma. Buddhism may simply be too set in its ways to be susceptible to any significant change. People have a lot of investment in preserving Buddhism in its traditional forms, and I've got nothing against that at all. I think that works very well for many people, and I've also, of course, in my own training, lived and trained and worked in these communities and have gained a great deal from them. But we're entering into a time, I feel, where the practice of the Dharma is something that's, I feel, attracting and appealing to more and more people. But that doesn't necessarily imply an interest in Buddhism. So maybe we can let go of the word Buddhism and simply talk about the practice of the Dharma, which is, of course, how traditionally Buddhists have always spoken. Buddhism is actually a kind of a Western invention, the word itself. But this actually all this does for many people is just raise another problem, because they'll then say, well, what do you mean by Dharma? It's a word that is widely used and very rarely, if ever, defined. Again, this is something it might be interesting to explore further over the weekend, so I don't want to go too much into it. But I do want to flag that Dharma means law. Those of you who know Mongolian, how many? No one. When the Mongolians translated the word Dharma into Mongolian, they called it Nom, N-O-M, Nom. And Nol comes from the Greek nomos. Probably the Mongolians got this from Central Asian cultures where Greek was sometimes spoken. But it's interesting that they use the word nomos, a Greek word meaning, once again, law. How things work in an ordered and lawful fashion. When the Buddha describes his awakening, at least in a text that I take to be quite significant here, the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, he talks of his awakening as being about having arrived at the Dharma. He's reached the Dharma. And what he means by the Dharma is two things. on the one hand, the Dhamma means conditionality, dependent origination, conditioned arising, how one thing gives rise to the next in a lawful fashion. That's Dharma, the law, as it were, of the unfolding of a causative, conditional world. And the other meaning, the other term he takes as equivalent to Dharma is nirvana. So when he says he reached the Dharma, he reached conditioned arising and nirvana. Nirvana, again, put out of your mind any mystical ideas you might have about that. It simply means the stopping of greed, of hatred, and confusion, whether momentarily or for longer period of time. It's a non-reactive space of mind. So the practice of the Dharma, I would argue, has to do with learning how to dwell in a non-reactive space as a way of responding imaginatively and effectively to the unfolding conditions of life. I'll say that again, but again, if you're going to be here over the weekend, we can come back to this. This is just a working definition, that to practice the Dharma means to dwell in a non-reactive space of mind as a way of responding imaginatively and effectively to the unfolding conditions of life. So the Dharma there is captured both as the unfolding conditions of life and the non-reactive space from which you respond to the unfolding conditions of life. And a secular Dharma would be one in which you live in such a way, and from a non-reactive space, responding to the unfolding conditions of life in an imaginative and an effective way, without needing to call upon any of the metaphysics of Buddhism, but simply to live that way in the context of the kind of secular world we find ourselves in now. I don't think the Dharma has anything to do with any sort of metaphysical belief. The Dharma is, for me, something that is primarily ethical. In other words, but ethical in the sense of flourishing as a human person, which we can also extend to flourishing as a human community. The practice of Dharma in a community is to support each other in living in this way to the best of our abilities, in order that both as individuals and communities we can become more fully human. We can realize those values that count most for us in our lives. So a contemporary secular Dharma community would be founded on two bases. First, I think it's important to return to the secular vision that is found in fragments in the early texts. Two of those fragments I cited. There are others. But basically to recognize there does seem to be a very fragile thread of ideas that has been preserved in certain texts, that has survived in certain forms of practice, that resonates very much with a secular approach. But the real challenge we face is to reimagine how such a vision might inform the kind of community that would be effective in the sort of world we live today. Again, I don't think I'm saying something terribly surprising there, but it does. But the way I presented this material does give rise to some, I think, quite difficult questions. If in a secular Dharma we put the emphasis on human flourishing, we put it on becoming independent of others, then what kind of community would provide the best support for those endeavors? That would seem to me what would be crucial to such a community that enables each member of that community to flourish as the kind of person they can become. It's a community that would thereby celebrate diversity and difference. A lot of religious and also political communities tend towards a kind of a club where everybody more or less believes the same things, and you stick together because you have a faith in certain truths, in certain lineages, in certain teachers. And community is sustained and developed through maintaining and reinforcing these common elements. The problem with that is that it doesn't give much room for individual difference of opinion or view. If you start criticizing some of the traditional doctrines, even if you're encouraged to look at the teachings critically, which many Buddhist teachers today often say, but in practice, if you start questioning reincarnation, for example, as I have done once or twice, you get into serious trouble. And it's not that in the trouble you get into, is not that you find yourself disagreeing with this person or that person or the teacher. The real trouble is that you are often excluded more and more from the community. People you thought of as your good friends are no longer terribly interested in hanging out with you. In other words, there's a kind of ostracization. If you step out of line, you are effectively excluded. Now, that's the sort of community I don't particularly want to belong to. But unfortunately, a lot of Buddhist communities today seem to run more on that line. There are Buddhist, like I was at Plum Village just a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to some of the monks there. And I learned that as a trainee monk, you're not allowed to read any literature except that of Plum Village. You can't read Stephen Batchelor's books for sure. You can't read any books that come from any other Buddhist traditions. Now, you could argue that there is a reason for that, but frankly, that horrifies me, that kind of approach. And they're not the only group. Many of the New Kadampa tradition and others likewise are very strict in censoring what the people can study and read. This makes me feel very uncomfortable. It's all about basically conformity. Community is about conformity, singing from the same hymn sheet, as we say in English. And if you step out of line, you sing a wrong note, you're excluded. Do we want that sort of community? I don't think so. I mean, I don't. Maybe some people do. They're terribly successful, by the way. People look for these kinds of communities of certainty and conviction, where everything seems to make total sense. That's what attracted me to Buddhism in the first place, to be honest, was a sense of, here's a group of people who know the truth, and we just have to follow these teachings of these enlightened masters, and we'll get there too. Doesn't always work out like that, but that's the idea. But I think the struggle for a community that celebrates diversity is that by giving more value to each person in the community becoming more fully who they are, more distinctive, more individuated, do we not weaken in some level the bonds that hold us together? we are not probably going to have such a strong sense of belonging if people are encouraged to think for themselves and think differently. I don't know the answer to that question, to be quite honest. That's something I feel we can explore perhaps this weekend. If we look politically at, let's say, the political spectrum in our cultures, but from conservatism to liberalism, conservatives tend to be the ones who are more committed to maintaining traditions and maintaining traditional communities. You see this very much in the United States. The Christian right, as it's often called, is very much concerned about maintaining the integrity of the Christian faith, as they understand it, as a defense against the liberal onslaught of individualism. And again, I can see why people would do that. But I think it does highlight how intentional communities seem to tend towards the conservative rather than the liberal. And I think my own presentation has somehow pointed in that direction as well. To conclude, because I've been speaking too much, just a few points which will perhaps be ideas we can further explore over the next couple of days. A community is not something you join. A community is something you help create. I've always found this idea useful. We often think that I'm looking for a community. People say, I really miss not having a community. And so I'm going to try and find a community, as though a community is kind of a ready-made body of people, and all you have to do is join, and you've got a community. That's not really a community at all. That's a club. A community is something you have to work at. A community is something that it should be understood as a practice. You have to cultivate a sense of community, which basically means cultivating relationships with other people. And you can't just expect that to happen by itself. You have to make an effort. You have to actually value the need to engage with others about these topics. And that's hard work, and it's not always easy or fun. In a Buddhist community, a Buddhist center, let's say, you might end up with a bunch of people who otherwise you probably wouldn't be very drawn to. All sorts of oddballs show up at these places. But you're challenged here to actually begin to form some kind of relationship with these people. You may not become the best of friends, and again, that's another mistake we make. It's not about becoming close bosom buddies. It's about learning to live meaningfully with other people who share common values. It's a deeper level of connectedness than just liking someone or feeling comfortable around someone. It's actually about learning to not be driven by your likes and dislikes of John or Mary, but recognizing that John or Mary share something with you about what human life is about, what it's for. So community, therefore, is founded on shared concerns. And I think it's important in any kind of group, like this one, for example, every now and again to actually reflect on what these shared concerns are. What is the glue that holds you together? It may not be something you can easily put into words, but I think it's a conversation well worth revisiting. And a community, as I've already mentioned, is formed through networks of friendship. There's passages in the suttas where the Buddha talks of friendship as being, or what he calls kalyana mitata, a good friendship, sometimes translated as spiritual friendship, is the whole of the brahmacharya, it's the whole of the spiritual life. It's not just something you do sometimes, but it's somehow integral and central to what it means to be part of a community, is to value friendship. And this brings us back to the Greeks. I've recently, a few weeks ago, I taught a weekend in London on Epicureanism. And I did this with my colleague John Peacock. And we only used Epicurean texts, fragments from Epicurus himself, and quite a lot from Lucretius, a first century BC Roman poet who wrote this text called On the Nature of Things. And what was interesting is that we could engage with the Dharma just as effectively through these texts as we could through Buddhist texts. And the Epicureans have many similarities with the early Buddhists. They lived in communities in a place they called the Garden outside Athens. They lived simply. They were open to all, men, women, slaves, free people. And they valued friendship. Friendship for Epicurus was the primary virtue, not wisdom. Friendship was more important than wisdom. And I'll just conclude by one of Epicurus's sayings, which is found in what is called the Vatican sayings. Of the things which wisdom provides, of the things which wisdom provides for the blessedness of one's whole life, by far the greatest is the possession of friendship. I will stop there.